Good evening. My name is Robert Lloyd, and welcome. I'm the Vice President of the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa, and I'd like to thank you all for being here this evening and being at this conference. We have a number of wonderful panels and discussions coming up over the next couple days, and many of you will be participating in them or listening in on them, and this is a wonderful opportunity for the Association of the Study of the Middle East and Africa to come together as scholars and policymakers, government officials, those interested in Africa and the Middle East, and to grapple with some of the challenges and opportunities of the region. This evening, we're in for a special treat for our guest speaker this evening, and we're really in some ways two special treats. I'd like to introduce Peter Pham. And so Peter Pham is actually he's no stranger. He's welcome back, Peter, Ambassador Pham, I should say. And a little bit of a background, and he will introduce our speaker for this evening. So in March 2020, Ambassador Pham was appointed the first ever United States Special Envoy for the Sahel region of Africa. From 2008 to 2017, he served as Vice President of ASMEA, my immediate predecessor as Vice President, and was founding editor-in-chief of our peer-reviewed Journal of the Middle East and Africa. Currently, Ambassador Pham is a distinguished fellow at the Africa Center of the Atlantic Council. He's many things. He's been a mentor to me. He was my former boss at the Atlantic Council when I was there as a non-resident fellow, and I got a lot to say. So, Peter, a warm welcome back to ASMEA. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be back at ASMEA after several years away. And I actually wouldn't be here this evening were it not for the pleasure of introducing our guest of honor this evening. Having just come across the Atlantic for the second time in 10 days, a couple hours ago, a sane person would be at home with my feet up and a nice single malt in my hand. But since I'm not known to be sane, and we have this distinguished guest here, that it's my great pleasure to introduce to you. When I left ASMEA to join the previous administration as special envoy for the Great Lakes and subsequently other posts, one of the things I sought, and the administration sought, but I did in my mission in the Great Lakes, was reliable and capable partners. And among those certainly is the Republic of Rwanda, a reliable and capable partner to the United States, and Ambassador Mathilde Mukantabana, who I've known for over a decade now, a great, reliable, and capable partner for me individually. I've had a long history with Rwanda, and we can talk about that in the conversation, I hope to. When I first my first visit to Rwanda came not long after the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. I saw then a country that was completely destroyed, needed to be rebuilt, and to see the miracle that has happened in the 30 years since then of the resurrection of that country is nothing short of extraordinary. And there are a lot of things about Rwanda one can say, but I just want to flag just two that I most especially admire. One is that over the years, I've seen the building of nationhood from the ground up with involvement in local areas of individuals. The Umuganda, the last Saturday of every month, when everyone in their local communities gets involved from 8 o'clock in the morning to later in the day in cleanup, grass cutting, building infrastructure, and everyone does it. It's that sense. And the other one that I would love to see implemented in the U.S., but that will be tied up in the courts for years and longer than any term, is the Imahigo, the performance contracts that every government official signs, which lays out clear priorities, measurable targets, and public accountability. Imagine federal bureaucrats with performance contracts that are accessible to everyone. Now you see why I'm considered insane and I'm engaging in fantasies. But anyway, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mathilde Mukantabana, who in many respects is a perfect keynote opening for ASMEA, because she's blends both our academic rigor and in her background as an academic, but also our policy relevance. She came to the U.S. In 1980, immigrating to Sacramento. I won't say give her age away. I know, I'm enough of a diplomat to know that. Enrolled at California State University, Sacramento, and earned her first master's degree in history, and subsequently went back and earned a second one in social work, all while raising 3 kids. When Rwanda was liberated by its own people and the genocide was put an end to, she went back to Rwanda and founded the Department of Social Work at the University of Rwanda in 1999, and then was serving back in the U.S. as an academic, a professor, and a tenured professor at Consome River College out in California. She's been awarded numerous honors, including a Doctor of Humane Letters from California State University and many other things. And so it's a great pleasure, and I would ask you to warmly welcome the Ambassador of Rwanda to the United States, my good friend Mathilde. Thank you. Thank
you. Good evening. Thank you so much, Peter, for the warm welcome and the introductions. There are many things that Peter has already said I'm not going to repeat. I had put it in my notes about what we do, but I think there's no better person who knows about my country and the rise and the reconstruction than maybe Dr. Peter, because he worked pretty much in the region, but also he became very much involved in the affairs of our countries. So, Prof. Mark Clark, ASMEA President, Ambassador Peter Pham, Dr. Robert Lloyd, ASMEA Vice President, and all the Joe Skelly, Secretary, and then ASMEA staff, Ezaf, Suzanne, and Emily. Distinguished scholars, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us this platform to share and to be able to have this conversation. The ASMEA Conference is not only a forum for reflection and discussion on African and Middle East studies, but also a platform for exchange of ideas and concepts that can drive collaboration and development for our continent. Today I speak from my perspective both as ambassador of Rwanda to the United States, but also as a former professor, like what Peter just mentioned, of African and African American history in my former life. African studies took shape in earnest during the 60s, spurred by the civil rights movement in the US and the end of colonialism in Africa. This movement developed partly as a reaction to the stark reality of how black people were perceived and treated all over the world, and partly as a reaction to the fact that black history had been distorted, oversimplified, and seen through 2 basic lenses that validated both slavery and colonialism. First, that Africa was a static continent, largely immune to the winds of progress that were sweeping the rest of the world. And secondly, that Africans, or black people, were of inferior order, And as you know, saving souls and civilizing missions were offered as a compensation for slavery and colonialism. It's quite understandable then that part of the struggle both for black nationalists in Africa and civil rights leaders in America was to overcome the debilitating stamp of inferiority by researching and communicating a black history that was fuller in scope and context. Central to the black socio-political movements and religious movements that took place after the Civil War in the United States and during the anti-colonial movements in Africa was a drive to develop a collective black identity and a heightened consciousness of the inventory of black contributions to the world. To be sure, I have to say that that quest for self-affirmation presented its own liabilities and challenges, as some insisted on the greatness of Africa by zeroing in on the ancient civilizations. Others insisted on publicizing well-rehearsed black inventions or the much-sung black heroes. Of course, both are important steps in the quest for recognition. Like other people, black people need icons and they need heroes. However, this should not be identified as the only contribution that Africa has made. As much as African civilizations didn't end with pharaonic Egypt or the great Zimbabwe, neither can the status of black be upgraded by substituting savage blacks with noble Africans. Both concepts, even the seemingly positive one, are dehumanizing. Our understanding of the contribution black people have made should go beyond the dichotomy of we versus them as a yardstick to measure how much we have accomplished and how far we have come. African studies has now matured into a complex multidisciplinary field that explores the diverse and dynamic landscape of African societies, politics, economies, and cultures. Over the years, the field has made strides toward more comprehensive and nuanced portrayals of Africa, moving beyond stereotypical representation and toward greater emphasis on African diversity and agency of the people. Scholars, researchers, and institutions are challenging the notion that Africa's story is one of only struggle, famine, and crisis. Instead, they are showcasing Africa's resilience, innovation, and the agency of the people of Africa. But I have to say that despite these advancements, significant gaps remain. Far too often, the portrayal of Africa remains overly simplistic or confined within the narrow parameters, overlooking the complexities that characterize Africa, and indeed the diverse narrative within each country. It is crucial for African studies to address these gaps as they influence perceptions, policies, and partnership at global, national, and community levels. Let me, since I'm coming from Rwanda and I know the country better, I'm going to make a little bit of an illustration of our history with an example of Rwanda. The story of Rwanda is one that exemplifies Africa's potential for recovery and growth. And yet, it's also one that is often oversimplified by understanding the country by just talking about 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. That has remained a defining chapter in our, of course it has remained a defining factor in our history. A brutal period from which Rwanda has worked diligently to heal, rebuild, and transform. However, the narrative in academia often focuses almost exclusively on this tragic event, overshadowing the remarkable progress and innovations that have occurred in the years since and altogether missing the tremendous transformation and resilience that have defined our nation's recent history. And I can mention a few, one or two that were mentioned by Dr. Pham, But from our peace-building initiative to our advancements in sustainable development, healthcare, and technology, Rwanda's journey has many lessons for those studying African nations. Our achievement in gender equality, for instance, have positioned Rwanda among global leaders, with women occupying over 61% in parliament seats and contributing immensely across all the sectors. Our environmental policies aimed at conservation have made Rwanda a pioneer in conservation efforts, symbolized by dedication, for instance, to save the last remaining gorillas and successful restoration of certain parks. Yet, much of this transformative work is underrepresented or understood in the African studies field. While a number of scholars and organizations are telling Rwanda's full story, there remains a need for a more balanced narrative that reflects both our challenges and our resilience, that capture our historical wounds and our current vibrancy and excitement. Research and literature on Africa have in recent decades correctly begun to highlight the importance of local agency, Africa-led solution. For instance, the often overlooked contribution of African nations to global peace and security. Rwanda's role in peacekeeping mission across the continent is a testament to this. We contribute some of the largest numbers, providing critical support to many countries facing conflict and instability. Yet, these contributions are often peripheral in literature that centers more on African needs rather on its strength that we can share among ourselves. Furthermore, the focus on security in Africa is frequently limited to traditional definitions that neglect the broader dimensions of human security. Rwanda, for example, has taken an approach that prioritizes human security, emphasizing access to health care, education, and economic opportunity as fundamental to our national security as well and stability. These dimensions are essential to understand the African security context and should be more prominently figured in research and discussion on the continent. Africa's historical and cultural contribution to the world are immense, yet they remain underrepresented in global narratives. African studies could benefit from more exploration into the rich cultural and intellectual traditions that define various African societies, including Rwanda. For instance, on traditions of Budehe that you just mentioned, that performance contract, and so on and so forth. They embody our political innovation and have informed our governance models, driving tangible improvements in our citizens' well-being and nation growth. In the same vein, African political systems are often criticized through the lens of Western democratic models, with less attention paid to the unique and indigenous forms of governance that exist across the continent. Rwanda homegrown solutions are an example of our commitment to finding approaches that work for our people, based on our experiences, context, and values. Scholars in African studies will do well to consider these indigenous approaches across the continent as a critical contribution to the study of global governance and democracy. Perhaps one of the greatest needs in African studies today is for more African voices. For too long, research and literature on Africa have been very much dominated by non-African voices, shaping narratives from outside perspectives. This dynamic is slowly changing, with more African scholars and institutions contributing to research and discourse. Yet, it's crucial that this trend continues and accelerates. African-led research can provide invaluable insights that are informed by lived experiences, nuanced cultural understanding, and a direct connection to local realities. And we are encouraging such efforts through initiatives such as the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, which offers high-level training in mathematical science to young Africans by Africans, the African Leadership University, and the newly introduced African School of Governance initiative. Institutions like this demonstrate that Africa can and should be at the forefront of research and innovation, contributing not only to the African narrative, but also to global knowledge. As scholars, students, and practitioners in African studies, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to shape more balanced, inclusive narratives about Africa. We have this thing we say in African Union and in many African countries, we say, building the Africa we want. But building the Africa we want entails exposing our youth to the everyday struggles and triumphs of common people in their midst, witnessing the striving by regular folks to maintain their dignity and to achieve their goals, even in the face of formidable challenges, opens for them and for all of us a world of possibilities. Focusing on oversimplified versions of Black accomplishments obscure very strength that exists in our communities, our individual families, and our individual histories. Let us challenge and expand the traditional framework that defined the African studies field. Let us work to understand Africa not solely through the lens of its struggles, but also through the triumphs, innovations, and the contribution to the global community. Rwanda's story is a part of a broader African story. It's also part of our human community. Thank you, and I look forward to the enriching discussion that will shape this year's ASMEA Conference. Thank you.
No? Okay. Ambassador, thank you for your remarks on Rwanda and Africa. One thing I had been in Rwanda before the genocide. That was my first experience. And then a few years ago, I was in there after the genocide. And like Peter, I was just amazed at the changes in the country, the cleanliness of the country. And everyone's going to get out there and work on Saturdays. And the organization. So you've talked about Rwanda and Africa by extension as exemplars and lessons we can learn. And you began to mention them a little bit. I was wondering if you could expand, like 2 or 3 things that you say, Africa, Rwanda in particular, Africa in general, can really help the world understand this better, or is something we want to examine as ways we might learn from Africa.
Thank you so much. And maybe what I can say, as I said before, Rwandan story is African story. It's a tiny microcosm of the continent. And what I was saying is that there are 2 things. First of all, Africa, you've followed the history, so I'm not going back to the history, but we are in a phase where Africa is trying to rally together, all the young people. And when I say that, it goes beyond the national boundaries. It's not just talking about Africa, but also its connections with the diaspora and many other people that are outside of Africa. But more importantly and central to this is that the fact that for us to be able to do this, it's also to acknowledge individual accomplishments by countries, because it will never happen one day. You also hear every day about the challenges we have. Lessons learned from other people and the lessons shared. We had a conference when we were talking about South-South cooperation. And we were with the South America countries, Asian countries, African countries. We all realized you can't really do it alone. Even if you are performing to the best of your capacity, it will never happen. But for us, we are strongly Pan-African. We believe that when Rwanda wins, Africa wins. This is why we say wherever we are going to begin in Rwanda, right now if you go, it's for Africa. So all those universities are open for all the Africa youth, so we can share also good practices, and we learn from other people. And it's also, that's the growth of our institutions. What I find even if you talk about the educational capacity, like even studies, just like the economic development, also studies are in development. You know, we have people who are also learning to come into this platform of Africa studies. This is why we are still behind, but also we are very happy because there are new people coming in, many young people who are interested in those studies. But what I was saying is that we've ceased to be on aspiration alone. You know, we were aspirational as a continent. Now we have started to be operational. By small steps, but we are being operational. If I can tell you, for instance, one example is you've heard about African Continental Free Trade. That is supposed to open the borders so people can do increase on intra-African trade. You know, it has started already. So we are trying to create those covenants, those symbols of coming together as a continent to share on what we can do together. So I think, I don't know if I answered the question, but this is, as much as we exchange in academia, as much as we exchange in the world, it's also exchanging among countries and without being represented, because I think there's a big mission and responsibility from people in academia to tell the story more accurately. Because if we are going to wait for politicians to change, for instance, their understanding on Africa or other countries, it will take a long time. But if people take the time to do scrutinized research, to go and find out about these countries, it's going to advance also the development. I see studies and development going together. And to understand the forum we are in, that can also be helpful to us as the people who work for their countries and so on. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to pick up where Robert left off and maybe tease a little further on that. I think because a lot of people, very often I've discovered, and this applies not just in academia, but certainly in government, people work with notions that whatever it is whatever training course they took, whether it be graduate school or training for their job, when they first started, is the picture that they carry on, you find a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades later. It's an ossified view, not taking account things that have changed. And that's, as you said in your remarks, that's problematic on a whole number of levels, but it's also problematic because it leads to bad policy outcomes because it's incorrect information. What can be, you mentioned the responsibility of scholars, and there are many in the room, but what can, what's your experience been and that of Rwanda, also engaging in on the political level and on the diplomatic level to do the same thing, to change the narrative, to make it more current and actually in conformity with reality. For those in the room who don't know, one of my endless bits of frustration, I'll put myself down, is the fact that now the United States is the only country in the world that has as its official position since the Obama administration to not say, call what happened in 1994 what it was, the genocide against the Tutsi. We have an official government position. When I was in government, I had to twist myself into a pretzel at the 25th anniversary. I think I successfully twisted myself into a pretzel, it's hard to imagine, in order to say what needed to be said without crossing the line and saying those words that were against U.S. government policy. And we stand alone in that. It's absurd. But really the question is to you, how do we move you've said what academics need to do, but what do policymakers need to do?
I think you should be telling me, but I know what we do. But it's true, he really tried to advance this because it was not a trivial matter, and it's not, even today, of not naming what happened by its proper name. Because once you don't, really, it was so clear, and the whole United Nations all the countries in the world accepted to name it for what it was. And I have to say it's a huge irritant in what we had to talk to the United States about, because it was not, and also people wouldn't really explain why, because there were times we were going to finish with it. There are quite a few states that had advanced to finish with it, bipartisan. The last commemoration we had in Congress, there are 3 Congress people of high caliber who said it the way it should be said, and actually we were confronting the State Department to use the proper terminology. President Clinton was in Rwanda for the commemoration of genocide and against the Tutsi, and he was able to talk frankly about that and also to see what can happen, because he was also the president who was in office when the genocide was taking place. So those are the things that are, so what do you say? We say one of the, and this is that big misunderstanding that we started with, like I mentioned in general. But we are not, also we have to say that our policy on Africa in general has been lagging. So understanding Africa and putting it in a proper perspective, putting it on equal footing with other continents is not there yet. We are always, at best, we are seen as a proxy place where great powers can come and fight. And this is the thing, as diplomats, we do on a daily basis. So the exchange, it's quite strange, because we have been, next week I'm going to California, where we started a conference on genocide and the Holocaust. That is international. It's the 6th time it's taking place. And universities have moved. That's why I'm saying that academia has a role to play. They were using the terminology way before all this controversy was happening. So what I'm saying is, for political reasons that you have to explain to me, it's still, there's still resistance in using proper terminology. But we don't cease to push. Once again, maybe our existence is also about to fight. It's not just to fight for Rwanda, but also to fight for Africa to be on the table. Most of the things, this is why I was saying that, if, not just in studies, but also in elements where it's about peace. How can you talk about peace and you ignore me who is at war? So Africa has to be in every type of forum where Africa's events and Africa's issues are being discussed. So those are things that it's our job on a daily basis. Sometimes that can be highly frustrating, but also there are milestones that are reached because of people who can understand and who can. So the way when I came to this embassy to now, we've gotten to a place where we have now strategic dialogue. So we've moved a few inches in trying to come to an understanding. So that's what we continue. But I have to say again, because we are talking about Africa, Rwanda will be well understood when African affairs are put in the forefront, where they are understood, where we understand that if we can accept genocide taking place and be defined in certain parts of the world, when it happens in Africa and it fulfills all those kind of things, it's also genocide. So for us, we saw it as something that was considering also the African affairs as less important. That's what I can tell you. Because there's evidence, strong evidence from UN. From yesterday, General Dallaire was speaking here in one of the forums. He was saying what he saw, how he was telling people. So it's not something that was not seen. And that didn't fulfill the definition of genocide. So why is that kind of hesitancy when it comes to this? So you can find all kinds of explanation. But the bottom line is that for people who see it, it kills also it handicaps a little bit the relationship that could be achieved without understanding those kind of fundamental questions that people have. Yeah.
I'd like to push a little bit more on the politics and more on African approaches. So you talked about the role of Africa in addressing international issues, lending its voice, and its experience in all of its complexities. So the African Union, for instance, it's a collective way in which African states can work together to address some of the challenges and opportunities on the continent. You know, its predecessor, the OAU, Organization for African Unity, talked about African solutions for African problems. So that's one of the core beliefs, you know, within it. So how does Rwanda and how does the African Union today work on that? I mean, there's a number of challenges. We know Sudan. We know Democratic Republic of Congo, you know, some of these ongoing challenges. And in the Sahel region, which Ambassador Pham, of course, knows very well. So how does Africa approach those issues to address the insecurity?
Yeah, we have a mechanism now. Africans actually, what you mentioned, all the crises that are taking place in certain parts of the world, including in my own region, there are tracks of people who are trying to bring mediation in the region. Like, for instance, you mentioned the Great Lakes, where we come from. There's a process going in Rwanda, Angola, that is trying to bring the parties together. So it's an African-led type of initiative. We have many, like peace mission from the African Union, where we wanted also to be self-funded, because the problem, we still have a few issues we are reforming. One of the things that African Union did in 2018 was to also bring strong reforms within the organization. Because, again, when someone is funding all your things, they can also control the direction of what you do. So self-funding mechanism were part of the reforms. And I have to say my president was the head of the reform mechanism at the African Union to see how Africans can really solidify their voices. And you know, there are many things that have happened then, and now you've heard now they are going to be part of G20. They are talking about putting African countries on the Security Council. So those are things that have been also pushed by African states, saying how can we have a voice when we don't even talk, when they are the big five who are speaking on our behalf, you know, in those forums. Yeah, so those are things that have been done. But we have a mechanism in Africa, and also the share. All the homegrown solutions you talked about, Peter, and I mentioned a little bit, they have been institutionalized. Now we have even trainings, like, for instance, in a peacekeeping mechanism in our country. And the country is not just from Africa coming to get those kind of training, or we export them, or we do stuff like that. So we share. And then we get other things from our neighbors we can learn from that are coming to add to what we have.